It is so great to see some of your names in the participants button here on Zoom. We're so glad you're here. As Eric said, my name is Elena Brokaw. I am the Barbara Bernard Smith Executive Director of the Museum of Ventura County. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be able to bring you the second installment of Behind the Scenes in Hollywood with Ivor Davis. Tonight, we're going to talk with Ivor about his experiences at the Ambassador Hotel on June 6th, 1968, the night Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Ivor was in the press entourage with Senator Kennedy across California as a journalist for the London Daily Express. Now, many of you have heard me talk about Ivor. He is one of our favorite speakers at the museum. He's a national treasure who is located right here in Ventura, California. We're very lucky he located here. Last time he was with us, he spoke about a really cheery subject, which was his experiences with the Beatles in 1964. And we talked about the film A Hard Day's Night. Tonight is a little heavier. But we are very thankful to Ivor for sharing with us. I would like to say that this evening's program, as are all the episodes in this program, they are made possible by Wagner Financial. Wagner Financial is a community leader in financial planning and a longtime supporter of the Museum of Ventura County. So I will stop talking and let you get to the main event, and that is Ivor Davis. Ivor, please take it away.
I hope you can see me. Good evening. And thank you to Museum Director Elena Brokaw, Deputy Director Denise Sindelar, and thanks to the technologically gifted Jonathan McGee and Eric Knight for helping this series get off the ground and run smoothly. Okay, Bobby the movie. So what do we have here? We have a very serious movie centered around the awful night Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June 1968. The film, directed by Emilio Estevez, one of the founders of the famous Malibu Rat Pack, remember them? Included Sean Penn and Rob Lowe. Estevez, of course, is also the son of actor Martin Sheen. He kept his family name so as not to cash in on his father's fame. And in this film, Emilio also hired his famous father. So sorry to digress at the beginning. Now, I watched Bobby again last week, and I must say that Estevez, who also co-starred in the movie, does a remarkable job. He's merging his Hollywood story footage with the actual news footage of that terrible night. It's worth watching the film even just for that, just for the clever melding. So Jonathan, if you'd be good enough, show us the trailer of Bobby. Thank you. Thank you for that. When I first saw the film back in 2006, I wrote that I'd been reluctant to see it. And watching it again, I thought, well, Estevez could have cut back on some of the soap opera side stories. It involved 22 actors, most of them pretty well-known faces. I also felt that the 44-year-old director somewhat trivialized that time in history with his Hollywood take, cluttering the story with those famous faces. However, some of you who watched the movie may vehemently disagree with me. Now, as I said, when I first saw the movie 14 years ago, I wrote, quote, I felt that the real story surrounding the murder of Kennedy didn't need those embellishments because it's distracting. Unfortunately, you end up star spotting. And as you watch the film, you say, oh, look, there's Harry Belafonte playing chess with Hannibal Lecter. I mean Anthony Hopkins, who, as those of you who have seen the film know, plays a retired hotel doorman at the Ambassador Hotel, a guy who can't stay away from his legendary workplace. And there's Mr. Sheen, and there's Sharon Stone, and what's her name? Demi Moore playing the alcoholic singer. And the rest of them, young Elijah Wood, Christian Slater, Lawrence Fishburne, Helen Hunt. Well, you get the picture. The film reviews, by the way, were mixed. Someone called it an updated Grand Hotel, referring to the star-studded 1932 film starring Greta Garbo, John Barrymore, and Betty Davis. And it was set in Berlin, not Hollywood. Another critic wrote, Mr. Estevez has reduced history to a bad melodrama. The Washington Post said, ambitious, uneven, a deeply affecting drama and full of good intentions. But as I said earlier, it's worth the wait. It captures the chilling scene in the kitchen, cleverly working in the old news, grainy news footage with the new stuff, and how the protagonists react to the shooting. So from that point of view, the music and the camera work, it's worth seeing. And by the way, you might ask, what happened to the legendary Ambassador Hotel, home of the Coconut Grove, where in my youth I went to see Sammy Davis and Streisand and Sinatra perform? Well, the filmmakers were able to shoot the film before the hotel was torn down. And here's an interesting sidelight. At one time, the Ambassador Hotel was sold to an American hotel owner, and he wanted to tear it down and build a skyscraper office building. The man who bought the hotel was a New York developer named, let me just see, Donald J. Trump. Eventually, the hotel was torn down, and today it is the home of the Robert F. Kennedy Community School, K through 12th grade. I also thought it was intriguing to listen to some of the stars of the film talking about the drama of making the movie in the place where it really played out. And so, before we go back to that awful night in June 1968, here's a few comments in a documentary that was made after the film was made from the actors about shooting Bobby. Well, I think it shows the passion that the actors had for the film. And some of you may remember, sort of ironically, that Martin Sheen played the President of the United States in that terrific West Wing series. And so I think they did it more less for the money, but more for the, for the honor, if you like. And that's why we got everybody that was in the film, 22 different actors who actually participated because they wanted to be in this historical film. Rather than me ramble on, I'm delighted that Elena Brokaw is going to join the conversation and take us in a slightly different direction, maybe back to June 1968.
Well, Ivor, thank you. And thank all of you for being here tonight. I mean, I watched the movie yesterday again, after having seen it in 2006. And it's actually pretty remarkable how it means different, as films do, mean different things to you depending on when you see it. But we've talked about the Hollywood version of the assassination. So let's talk about what actually happened with somebody who was actually there. So you were there at the Ambassador Hotel that night. I want to talk with you a little bit about that, as well as the lead up to that, specifically the stop here in Ventura. But let's just start with you. So how was it that you were there on the campaign trail with Senator Kennedy?
Yes, well, I was very fortunate. My newspaper, the London Daily Express, was writing a book, and they wrote a book, and it was called Divided They Stand. And it was all the foreign correspondents in America were going to cover a different candidate. So I ended up, fortunately or unfortunately, being assigned to Bobby Kennedy, because if you remember, and I think I might have mentioned that he didn't start off as a favorite. Eugene McCarthy was a hot favorite, a very Vietnam peace candidate. So was Bobby. So I was very lucky to get on that trip. And I must tell you, Elena, that as you saw in that footage, Kennedy, I saw Kennedy on the day he got to the hotel. His hands were raw, really, because everybody wanted to touch him. They just wanted to touch him. And on the day that he showed up at the Ambassador Hotel late at night, like 11:30 p.m., he had started the day. We started in San Francisco. We flew to San Diego. We flew back to LA. In the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, he went for a nap at the home of John Frankenheimer, the famous Hollywood producer who was a great buddy of his. And I remember we just swung by Malibu, and I looked into the garden or the patio, and there was Bobby. I mean, actually, I thought he was dead. He was sleeping on a lounge chair, and because he was totally exhausted. So then off we went to the Ambassador Hotel, which was going to be the headquarters. And that's when all hell broke out.
Sorry, I was on mute. John Frankenheimer, didn't he direct The Manchurian Candidate? Do you remember?
He did. And he was such a buddy. He was so close to Bobby Kennedy that I discovered that he was so absolutely shattered that his friend Bobby was killed that he moved to Europe for a while, although his career was in Hollywood. So he did that film, The Manchurian Candidate, years before, because as you pointed out, that's about a guy who is brainwashed to kill the president of the United States. I mean, talk about bizarre coincidences.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, okay, at the time on June 6th, in 1968, how long had you been on the campaign trail with him? And can you give us a general flavor of what that was like? Because probably most of us have never been on a campaign trail with a presidential candidate.
Well, what the interesting thing was that we went to San Francisco, and on the day of his death, of course, we flew back. But we had also gone to the Central California areas to come down on a train, would you believe, a kind of whistle-stop train. And I think I might have mentioned, not in a previous conversation, that he met Cesar Chavez and he met Dolores Huerta, who was speaking to the museum just a few days ago. And again, what a strange coincidence. So he had the farm workers of America and of California supporting him ferociously. But as I said, it was almost like, I hate to use the phrase a rock star, but he was there and people idolized him. And so by the time we got to LA, the mood of the crowd, the mood of his supporters was so upbeat. It was unbelievable. And then, of course, we discovered that Bobby was leading Eugene McCarthy. And don't forget, California has a lot of electoral votes for them to go to Chicago, which is where the convention was going to be. And winning California was a huge success for Bobby. And of course, the night, like about 11:45 p.m. on that night, we all got into the ballroom. We'd been getting forecasts, we'd been watching the news, and Bobby was going to win California until that moment.
So Ivor, I was talking with my husband earlier today about this and about you know, the fact that Bobby Kennedy was running for president and his brother had been assassinated, and about the fact that Robert Kennedy himself thought that there was a chance he might be assassinated. And you were part of the press corps. And did you, and it was such a volatile time in our history, did you feel that while you were on the campaign trail?
What I felt was that Bobby Kennedy had no fear, which was ridiculous. And those days, you've got to remember, there was not a law, a federal law to say presidential candidates get Secret Service cover, protection. It did not exist. And what amazed me was that he waded into people. It didn't matter who they were. It was almost as if he was invincible. And so that was happened all the way down. And I can't tell you how passionate the crowds were about Bobby. And again, as I say, the only guards that he had protection was Rafer Johnson, a decathlon gold medalist, and Roosevelt Greer, big guy, who was a football player. I forget which team. I'm not into American football, but Rosie Greer was big. Anyway, he had those two guards. However, when we got to the hotel and when he gave his victory speech in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, the guards, the security guards were there, but they couldn't prevent it happening.
Okay, so I want to get to the actual kitchen and what happened there in a minute. By the way, my husband, my encyclopedia here tells me that Rosie Greer was with the LA Rams. So just
thank you for making my day. Thank you.
Let's talk about Ventura for a bit, because one of the things that the museum has talked about is that he did do a stop here. I believe it was at the mall, the Pacific View Mall.
He did. There are great pictures of him at the Pacific Mall in Ventura. He'd done Oxnard Colonia, then he came to the mall, and the reaction in Ventura County was ecstatic. I mean, there were huge crowds, hundreds and hundreds of people, but that was the picture, that was the scene. So Ventura County looked as though it was going for Bobby Kennedy. I can't remember what the figures were, but there you go. Yes.
And by the way, at that point, let's talk about you a second. You weren't living here, right? So Ventura, Oxnard, Ventura was all new to you?
Ventura was totally new. I didn't know the mall from the Colonia. And I was living in LA. I think I was married about 7 months, living in Los Angeles. And so I came upon Ventura. I don't think, to be honest, with all due respect to Ventura, I never said, hey, that's a great place to live. But I did say that much later.
Well, yeah, I would hope so. Yes. Well, you ended up here. So it all worked out.
Yes.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that night. I mean, where were you during that? In the movie, they talk about going to the, I forget if it's the Colonia room or whatever room that they go to for his speech, and then they move into the kitchen. So where were you during all of that?
I was about 10 feet behind Bobby in the embassy ballroom as he delivered his triumphant victory speech. And and I remember it vividly. We saw a little bit of it on the film footage, but he said he wanted to thank his dog Freckles. And then he said, oh, I'm sorry, my wife Ethel, sorry to give her second billing. So he was in a buoyant mood. And then he said those amazing words, and now on to Chicago, where the convention was going to be. And those were the last words he ever spoke in public. It turned out to be, because what happened was we knew there was going to be a press conference in another room, and they took a shortcut through the kitchen into the pantry. And I must tell you, after that speech, I mean, winning California was huge. And I want to tell you, if I may, what I remember about that. I was about 10 to 15 yards behind him. And suddenly I heard balloons popping. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I thought, well, that was balloons. And then moments later, I heard women screaming. Now, I was behind and I stepped into the doorway of the pantry, and Stephen Smith, who was Bobby's campaign manager and who was his brother-in-law, grabbed me by the shirt sleeves and said, "You can't come through." Well, to be honest with you, I felt I needed to push my way through. I pushed past him, and I always say this, I mean, he kept hands onto my sleeve, and he ripped the sleeve off of my shirt. So I was moving fairly quickly. I stepped inside the pantry, and it was total bedlam. There were people screaming. There was a newsman screaming, "Get the gun, get the gun." I looked around, and on the concrete floor was Bobby Kennedy, bleeding from the head, and his wife, Ethel, was nestling his head on one of those straw campaign boater hats. And she put her hand up and said, "Give him air, give him air." And on the left, there was a kind of a rugby scrum of bodies. I didn't see who was underneath there, but it obviously was Sirhan, the killer, because one didn't stop and see that. The next thing I saw as Bobby lying there bleeding, people screaming, "Not, oh no, not again." Somebody shouted, "They shot him." That was later to haunt the police, because "they shot him" was reported as "we've shot him." So that led to things about, is there a second gun? Maybe there is, who knows? But the total confusion there. I looked up, and standing on the kitchen metal table was a guy called Harry Benson. And Harry Benson is a brilliant photographer. He's legendary today. He was fairly legendary then. And he was taking pictures of the wounded senator. And later on, people said, "Harry, how could you take pictures?" And he said, "Well, I just kind of kicked into automatic, as people do. And I was doing my job." And his pictures are pretty gruesome, and they're iconic today. But that was the other thing that I saw. And then I must say, they came in with a stretcher. They took Bobby out, and I looked around, and there were other people, I didn't know who they were, who were wounded and bleeding. It was like a battlefield. It was ridiculous. And then I stepped outside of that awful scene I just described and started talking to some of the so-called eyewitnesses who came out, because we wanted to know from them, what did you see? What did you see? And then I must say, for the next 2 hours, I spoke to eyewitnesses. And I must tell you, if I may interrupt the flow of what I'm saying, Elena, about a week ago, I was looking at some ABC News footage. And lo and behold, I saw, I forget the name of the guy from ABC television who was doing the live commentary. And he was talking to some of the witnesses who'd seen what they said they saw, and it was confusing. And so in that melee of talking to witnesses, you may see a young man taking notes who was much younger than I am today and had a bit more hair than I had today. So I wondered if Jonathan could show us the raw live footage of what happened moments after the shooting, and how confusing the eyewitnesses were. So Jonathan, can you give us those takes, please?
Carl George, the ambassador. I have an eyewitness with me. Your name is... What is your name, please?
Valerie Schulte.
And Valerie, what happened? What did you see?
All I saw was about 2 feet behind the senator and off to his right. He stopped to shake hands with some of the waiters that were off to his left.
That's right here in this room.
It was, yes, up about 10 feet from here. And the crowd that was moving with him kept going. He stopped. As he stopped, a man came up from in front of him, or where the direction that he was going in.
Like he was facing you?
He was going in this direction, and he stopped, turned this way, and all of a sudden the man came from this direction, and the shots started. They sounded like cap guns. I couldn't tell you what the man looked like, and I ducked and ran.
Did you see the senator fall?
No, I didn't.
Could you describe the man who fired the shots?
No, I couldn't.
You have no description at all?
No, I don't.
Was he a waiter?
I couldn't
Could you
say.
tell me what he was wearing?
I'm sorry, I couldn't tell you at all. I couldn't make any valid judgment.
And your name again is?
Valerie Schulte.
An eyewitness report from the Ambassador Hotel. Valerie Schulte was with the senator, close by his side when it happened. She heard the shots fired, as she said, and then ducked, as she put it, and to the side to get out of the way. She says she did not see the shots fired. All right, now back to News Central.
Here. Dr. McBrew, would you tell us what the man who fired the gun or his apparent accomplice said?
Well, the man who seemed to have fired the gun, as I could determine it, they were getting him out, was that he's trying to do something for the good of the country.
Do you remember his exact words at all? Could you almost quote?
All I could hear him say, I did it for the country. I did it I love my country. I did it for my country, or something to that effect.
Did you hear any words from the man who apparently fled, or is rumored to have fled?
The only thing I know, he said, let me by, let me out. And
that's the man. Do you have a chance to talk with the senator tonight at all?
I just said hello to him, and he waved. I didn't talk to him at length or anything.
Did he make
As
any
came
comment
in.
to you?
No, other than, hi.
Did he say anything when he was hit, you know?
No, I just sort of heard an oh. To tell you frankly, it was elation and then just sudden shock.
What do you mean elation and shock?
I mean, he was sort of tired but happy. I mean, he was sort of tired and happy, and he was sort of getting out. And I understood he was a little concerned. He was kind of looking around for his wife. That's what I understood, because she had become a little faint.
Well, that's pretty much soon after the shooting. But let me tell you, if I may, I know you're going to ask some questions, Elena, but you saw Valerie Schulte, and I want to tell you the next day in some of the newspapers around the country, they were talking about looking for a second shooter, and they were talking about looking for a woman in a polka dot dress. It shows you how insane the reportage was. And it was insane. In fact, Valerie Schulte was a Kennedy campaign worker. And then the second, the gentleman who said he saw a second gunman leave the room and say, I've got to get out of here. Well, I mean, we have time to consider it. What probably happened was the guy was a reporter, and he shouted, let me through. I've got to get out of here. I've got to phone my story in, or whatever it was. So what I'm saying these stories to you is because a simple fact, or a simple horrible fact, can be completely contorted out of all recognition. And so they never found the second gunman. Sirhan, the Jordanian immigrant, said he killed Kennedy because he disagreed with his policy about the Palestinians. But I think why I thought those film footage that we saw a moment ago was important was because it showed you that nobody really knew what took place. There was not really a solid eyewitness account. So go ahead, Elena. I've been talking too long.
No, I think it's fascinating in that chaos and how people create their own truths and their own stories in the face of that chaos. I also have to say, I'm very impressed by how close you got in there, Ivor. That was very impressive. And you haven't aged a day.
Thank you.
Would like to say that.
Thank you for that. Oh boy, that's made my day.
Absolutely. So just, a couple more questions. So after all of that chaos, when did you actually learn that Senator Kennedy had died? And did you think that right away? Can you even repiece that in your memory?
Yeah. All I can remember of seeing, I mean, when you see a man bleeding severely, you don't know. He was awake. I do remember that. His eyes were not closed. He was not unconscious. And then they took him off. And then you've got to realize with the bedlam, I keep talking about bedlam, the craziness that was going on outside. And we got reports from the hospital. He went, first of all, to General Hospital, where they discovered they needed to put him into intensive care and he needed to remove bullets from his brain. And so he was moved, I think, to Good Samaritan Hospital. And I remember that we thought he might be dead because we heard like an hour later that he'd been given last rites by a priest. Well, I mean, when you're given last rites, it's the end, I think. But then about 2 hours later, Mankiewicz, his press person, said, the senator is not dead. The senator's heart is beating and his heart is good, I think he said. I forget the exact words, but he said that, but he gave a somewhat positive thing. And then unfortunately, 24 hours later, we went to the Good Samaritan Hospital and Mankiewicz stood up and in gray-faced, ashen, just said, Senator Robert Kennedy died. I forget the exact time. And we knew it was the end. And that was it. I want you to throw in, if I may, I know you didn't ask me the question, but I want to talk about odd memories, if I may, that came up. And I must tell you, I didn't think about them until a few days ago when I was preparing to talk to the museum. And I'll tell you what they are, and they're kind of weird. Now, minutes after the shooting, I interviewed a young man named Martin Petruski, who was a waiter at the hotel. And he talked about shaking hands with Kennedy seconds before he was shot. And here's the coincidence number one. My wife, Sally, who I think I mentioned I'd been married for less than a year, was waiting for me at a friend's house in Beverly Hills, where she was watching the returns on television. And I was supposed to pick her up after the speeches and drive her home. The guy I interviewed was Martin Petruski. My wife and my friends were Bernard and Susie Petruski, the cousins of this waiter. Now that was a weird coincidence. I mean, I didn't think about it until a few days ago. Now, I don't know if, well, I mentioned this, 5 other people were shot that night, including a young newsman whose first name was Ira, reports for Sketchy. Now, my wife, Sally, heard the name Ira, and it sounds a bit similar. He was a reporter. Did they mean Ivor or Ira? Well, it sounds silly, I know. However, 3 hours later, I called her and said, I'm fine, everything's okay. The name of the guy was Ira Goldstein. He was a reporter, and he made a full recovery, as did the 4 others who were wounded. So again, communication was not the same as it is today. If I'd had my cell phone, I would have called her right away and said, I'm fine, Sally. But it was not around in those days. So that's really, I don't know if there's anything else to add, but yes, as I said a moment ago, Robert Kennedy died 25 hours after he was shot. He was 42, just 42. And he left a pregnant widow, Ethel, who was about to deliver his 11th child. So I don't know if you have any questions or how I'm sure some people might have, some viewers who have tuned into this may have some questions. Go ahead.
I have a huge amount more questions, but I would love to open it up to any viewers or participants who have questions. I think Denise Sindelar, our deputy director, has been watching those and can pass them over to us. So if we have time, I would love to come back and ask you just two more things, but I will bow out for the moment.
Okay, thank you, Ivor. So Bob Wilson is wondering if Robert Kennedy's charisma was as noteworthy as they say.
Sorry, was Robert Kennedy's what did you say, Denise?
Charisma. Was his charisma everything that people say it was?
Bob, the answer to the question is yes. He was fluent, he was fluid in dialogue, he liked people, and it showed. It showed when he was on the campaign trail. Of course, in those days, you could go up and you could touch within inches away, Bob. And I think you see with his dialogue, with his speeches, that he had a charisma that might have, probably would have propelled him to the White House. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question, Ivor, is given the chaos and confusion in the kitchen, how is it that you remember that scene so vividly? Why is it etched in your memory?
Because it was such a traumatic event. And I want to tell you that everyone who was there was in some state of shock. And if you talk to them today, and some of them are not around, unfortunately, they will tell you that here's what happened. There's Sandy Gibbons, who was a reporter for City News Service, a terrific reporter who covered the Manson trial with me years later. She was there, and if you talk to Sandy today, she will give you chapter and verse of what she saw. And there's certain things in life that you do remember. I can't remember what happened yesterday, but I can remember what happened over half a century ago. Thank you.
So Bob Wilson has one other comment, and he's wanting your opinion. He said, autopsy shows contact wounds from behind. The Dr. Thomas Noguchi paid a great price to get that info out. Does that contradict what some of the eyewitnesses say?
Well, if you are a conspiracy theorist, you can, I mean, I've seen many podcasts with people saying, well, look, there were 12 shots and that Bobby was shot in the head and somebody had to be behind him and Sirhan was in front of him. And I must say, you can discuss this until the cows come home. It's the same with John Kennedy. I remember reading that Lee Harvey Oswald was the worst rifleman in his infantry. He couldn't shoot straight, and yet he shot John Kennedy. So the theorists that you can talk to, and you can find 50 books on why there was a second gun at the John Kennedy event and why there was a second gun at the in the kitchen at the hotel. And I don't know, I'm not inclined to think that way, but when you get two members of the family, John and Bobby, gunned down the way they were, and there's no doubt whatsoever that Bobby incensed the mafia, he incensed organized crime, and there's all sorts of webs of deceit and webs of conspiracies that if we had another hour, I'm sure we could talk about. But even though the coroner, and I don't exactly know off the top of my head, except that Bobby was shot in the head and was bleeding from the ear and the head, and how many bullets, I don't know. So Sirhan had a gun with 8 bullets in it, and somebody said there were 12 shots. So, you make your decision, you decide. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question here from Alana Wolf. Do you have any mementos from that evening, such as a press pass or perhaps memorabilia from the Ambassador Hotel?
The answer is no, because I must tell you this, Alana. I mean, I was young and naive and stupid in a way, because who thought of history and who thought of mementos? I mean, the classic story I always tell is that, and this is completely different, is that one of my first big jobs in America was traveling with a rock and roll group from Liverpool. Now, they went on to become very famous. And I got about 10 autographs from this rock and roll group from Liverpool, signed photos. And I gave every one away. And if I kept even one, I probably could have picked up a little bit of change from collectors, because everybody wants mementos. I mean, I didn't even, as I say, I wish I'd taken my iPhone camera with me to the Beatles and to the Bobby Kennedy Hotel. So there's my answer.
Okay, we have another question from Skip and Ann Gutzman. If you were portrayed in the movie Bobby, who would you have wanted to play you?
Other than Warren Beatty? Oh, that's an interesting, funny question. Who knows? Sal Mineo? No. I don't know. Maybe an English actor. Alec Guinness? No, he's too old. I'm sorry to be, I'm treating this with a bit of frivolity. Maybe you want a serious answer, but I have a hard time. Michael Caine, there we go. Michael Caine, me. Michael grew up in my neighborhood. He was a Cockney like me. And if Michael is around and they want to redo it, oh, he's probably a bit older than me now. Anyway, that's the answer, silly as it is.
I think it's a pretty great answer. And by the way, I think we should make this a little interactive and have all the participants say who they would like to play them.
Yes, that's a good idea. Great.
I've asked my husband, he's right here. He's thinking.
Okay, thank you. Well, if he's in law enforcement, he can decide who's going to play Roosevelt Greer and who's going to play Rayford Johnson and who's going to play.
I don't think he's going to be Rosie Greer. Okay, so I have a question for you, Ivor, which is, so you were in the press corps, and that's one of the things I've always thought about is, what is it like to be in the press corps? And I know you're not in any press corps today, but how do you think it might have changed? So what was it like back then? Where did you sleep? Did you have your own bus? How much time did you get with the candidate?
We did. We had our own bus, and we were known as the boys on the bus. There were girls there, but very, very few, strangely enough. It was never the boys and girls on the bus. And we did, whenever we stopped off, we stayed in a hotel in San Francisco, or of course, when we came back to LA, I could go home. And there was a lot of camaraderie. And the thing you've got to remember, Elena, is that, again, to keep harping on this, communications back then was slim. I mean, if you wanted to phone a story over, you didn't have a computer, you couldn't write it and send it over. If you had a photograph to send, you had to go down to the Associated Press and print your picture, put it on a roller and radio it to London, which took an hour. I mean, look at it today. You've got a JPEG, and before you say JPEG, it's in London. It's different. It's a whole different ball game. And so communication was so, well, it wasn't archaic, but you know what I mean? It was old-fashioned compared to today's standards. And so everybody was pretty friendly. Some of the political reporters had the inside track to Bobby. Some of them were from Washington, D.C., and the candidates knew that it was important to get it on the good side of them. I mean, I was just a visiting guy. I mean, I was thrown onto the bus. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the camaraderie, and I enjoyed doing the stories. And it was fun, except when we came to the Ambassador Hotel that night, and then it was not fun anymore.
Were there a lot of foreign press? I mean, that's featured in the movie, right? The Czechoslovakian reporter,
Yeah.
but were you the only member of the foreign press?
No, I think there was somebody from the London Times, and there was a guy from Reuters news agency on the bus, which was the big foreign news agency. But again, the news agencies are probably, most of them, except for Reuters and one or two others, gone with the wind today. They're out of business because communications have knocked them out. So, of course, the story in the movie was about this woman. I think she's from Czechoslovakia or somewhere, and wanted 5 minutes. And to be honest with you, I think the Kennedy aide sort of gave her lip service, because she never, of course, got her interview, and she just wanted it. So that was an interesting side story to those who've seen the movie, like you saw it recently. So there was an eclectic bunch of people, not a lot of foreign correspondents. And the reason that I spent so much time with Bobby Kennedy was because I was going to write the chapters of the book, Divided They Stand, about Bobby. And then, of course, it blew up.
Do you feel like that experience changed your career in any particular way, or changed your attitude in any way?
Well, I must say, it probably gave me an invisible coat of armor. It's interesting you should ask that. I've never been asked that question. And I'll tell you how I knew that I had this invisible coat of armor. In 1980, John Lennon was shot. And I want to tell you that it was a horrible thing as well, shot in the Dakota apartments in New York City. And I just said, oh my God, am I living in a country where people get bumped off like that? It's just an awful, awful feeling. And therefore it gives me this emotional protective thing. How have I changed? I don't know. I think when you get older, you think more about sudden death. But the ridiculous thing is that as a newspaper foreign correspondent, you're covering the Kennedy assassination one day, and the next day you go on to do an interview with Marlon Brando or Peter Sellers or somebody like that. So unfortunately, I wish I'd been an editorial writer, Elena. I would have sat back and done the kind of thinking that you are asking me to do today. But when you cover stories for a daily newspaper that has an enormous appetite for news stories, you move off from a horrible thing like the Bobby Kennedy assassination to the next story, whether it's a frivolous one or it's an important one. So you build up this attitude, and only years later do you really say, hey, I should have thought more about it. I should have been more thinking about how it affected me. But unfortunately, that's the way it rolls.
Well, yes, although I'm sure it helped you in your career to be able to roll like that. But how fascinating to think about going from, something like what happened at the Ambassador Hotel to a conversation with a lion tamer or whatever,
Yes.
I'm not saying you had that.
The question, people say to me today, well, my God, after you traveled with the Beatles for 5-6 weeks, what happened? How did you feel? I said, well, the next day, the office called me in London and said, the Warren Commission report has come up with the findings on John Kennedy. We want a story. Boom. You don't get a chance to savor or savors the wrong word, you don't get a chance to analyze what you did yesterday, because today you have to focus on the next big story.
I mean, I'm happy for us to be the people with whom you can spend a little bit of time analyzing it, right? And also celebrating it. Interestingly, as I was asking that question, Janine asked, did it take you long to recover from this?
Yeah.
Kind of
Well,
the same question.
Janine, that's the answer to the question. I mean, I want to tell you that we were in a state of shock. And I think you saw the film footage earlier of the people just asking questions, not really knowing. And you do that. You go into, I mean, if you're a photographer, you continue taking pictures. If you're a reporter, you continue asking questions to try and get a big picture. As I say, I wish I'd been more analytical back then, but I think sometimes a lot of people do not become analytical until they get a bit older, because you're living life day to day. It's exciting, it's intriguing, it's interesting, but I wish I'd kept a day-to-day diary. And as I say, I wish I took my iPhone camera with me.
Well, you know, you were already writing a lot. So to ask you to get home and then relax by writing is a bit much. But it is wonderful to be able to spend this time with you and to glean all of these still very present treasures from your mind.
Well, thank you very much. And what I think you can do now is you can send me an analytical bill for enabling me to regurgitate. Thank you.
Well, we'll do that if all of the participants on this call will tell us who would play them in the movie. Nobody has put that in the chat, and I've been watching. I would just like to say.
Okay. Well, the other thing I want to say, Elena, thank you for getting me to do this program, because it's made me rethink myself as well. But the good thing is, in our next get together, we will be talking about something a little less austere, a little less terrible. And it's going to be just me hanging out with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Remember them?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. Talking about the William Goldman script. I look forward to it. So yes, that is our cue. Thank you, Ivor, for serving that up for me to close off tonight. Ivor, thank you so much again for sharing with us your very personal memories. It's really, it's interesting to look back on that time from this standpoint right here. So our next episode of Behind the Scenes with Ivor Davis will be on October 22nd. And we ask you to watch Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid before you get together with us. Hopefully I will be invited back to ask Ivor some questions, because I enjoy it tremendously. The RSVP button is open for that right now. Really quickly, I want to give a couple of shout outs before they drop off of the call to some participants. So many of you, I recognize your names, but I really want to recognize Sean and Paul Carlson. Hopefully you're still on. They're here, I think, from either in Seattle or right outside of Seattle, Washington. I forget which, but they're members of the museum. Thank you. And Eileen Gavinman, who was the librarian that made me into a book reader when I was a kid. I cannot say enough about Eileen Gavinman and how she turned me into a person with a huge world, even though I lived in rural Santa Paula. So thank you, Eileen. And thank you all of the rest of you. Thank you, Wagner Financial, for supporting us. And especially thank you, Ivor Davis. It has been a pleasure to have you here with us tonight.